So when you find yourself in a traumatic situation, and when you find yourself having experiences that you go like, this doesn't feel like me. I feel like I'm behaving strangely here. That's the stuff you work with. That's the stuff you pay attention to.
A switch point moment is a moment in time that fundamentally changes your life because of a connection you made with another human being. My name is Shawn P Neal, and this is the Switch Point Project. And hey everybody, welcome to the Switch Point Project. Today is a day we're going to talk about a very important topic, and that's the topic of trauma. And before you go too far, before you start to assume what that means, I'm going to tell you that what we're going to talk to my guest Luke Renner about today is going to blow your mind wide open. Now, Luke has been nominated for a Gospel Music Association Dove Award. He's earned 8 gold and 9 platinum RIAA video awards. And he's directed projects which spent over 400 weeks on Billboard Magazine's top video sales charts. He's an amazing filmmaker, and this docu-narrative that he has created called What Lies Inside is all about how trauma affects us and keeps infecting us until we can face it face to face. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm excited that you're joining us. As always, stick around for just a few words from our sponsors, and we'll be right back with my guest, Luke Renner, and we're going to be talking about what lies inside. Luke, you first of all, you and I, no secret here, have known each other and, kind of cross paths and work together on and off throughout the years doing some different community projects.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's been really fun to watch your journey. And then what started to happen was I saw that you several years ago started working on this. I guess it's a docu-narrative is the official.
That's what I'm calling it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a documentary, but it's you've seen, it's not quite the same as like turning on a camera and watching sugar gliders bounce through the trees and having Morgan Freeman narrate about it. It's not quite that. It's a little more experiential probably and weird. I describe it as almost magazine style.
Sure.
Because it definitely bounces in and out of different rhythms and ideas, different approaches exist inside of the film itself. So sorry to cut you off, but yeah.
No,
it's docu-narrative because it's kind of weird. That's why we called it that.
Well, I like it. And I think weird is an interesting way to describe it because, and let me tell people a little bit about this. It's called What Lies Inside. And this is really about trauma. And what I was learning as I watched it was, that the trauma that we talk about and our anxiety and things brought on by it is typically not even known to us, maybe what caused it or where it's at or that it's even there.
The things that count, we're finding out, is that the things that count as trauma, meaning they're capable of altering the course of our life, maybe changing our ability to make good decisions or to feel confident so we're not afraid all the time, whatever the case may be, that a lot of those things which can literally change the course of your life, as you just pointed out, can oftentimes be they don't register to the individual as trauma. It's not just the big obvious stuff that counts when it comes to, and to be clear, we're talking about psychological trauma, not for example, head trauma or
right.
Something like an automobile accident per se. But
to be clear, and this was a definition that was actually given by someone on the film, trauma is an experience that overwhelms the ability to cope. And,
yeah,
first of all, I've never really looked at it in that way. So I want to put that in context and put that out there to begin with. But let's rewind a little bit because you grew up in a very faith-based home. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a very fair statement. Yeah, we were growing up evangelical, charismatic, non-denominational. So evangelical sort of embodies the idea of trying to go out and get people to become a Christian. So you don't just sit there and hope they show up. You're either knocking on doors, or in my case, we would go on trips to other countries and try to get people saved, so the short-term missionary trip. That's the evangelical. Charismatic, we're talking music that's not hymnals. It's not organs. There's probably not a choir. It's more like a rock band on stage. Charismatic, in our case, meant speaking in tongues, casting out demons. By the time I started to sort of remove myself, things were getting a little too interesting for me. I'll just kind of leave it at that. But and then the non-denominational piece means that church is generally not supported by some larger organization. My dad's been a pastor since before I was born. Still a pastor. He's closer to retired now, but just totally wrapped up in that world.
I saw some stuff where you were you were on stage, you were preaching the gospel at a young age, and you were very much there.
I was all in. I was definitely all in. It's actually hard for me now. I don't say this in any sort of a demeaning or derogatory way, but I'm very different now than I was then, and it's really interesting now, just to see how far I've come in terms of change. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm in the better place. I don't know where I'm at, but I was hook, line, and sinker. I was fully bought in. I believed all those things that I was saying, and really was panicked in a way about making sure that people got saved before they died and went to hell. That was a real fire, so to speak, that was lit under me. I had that purpose.
Well, and that's a lot for somebody.
That's a lot for a kid
of that age. Yeah, absolutely.
I got to see a lot of the world as a young man. Starting with Haiti. My dad took me on my first trip when I was 14. Wow. And then eventually when I went to college and started working in television and film, which is what I have been doing for 25 years or so now, then even television took me on even more trips. So I've said to my wife, I'm 46 now, but if I were to die anytime soon, I've seen my fair share of the planet. I've had a really fortunate run of it so far. But it started with church. Church was the thing that had us running around at first.
And this is kind of where the story picks up now as an adult. It was you and your wife, you moved to Haiti.
I was working on the television side of the Christian music industry, straight out of college, for a handful of years. I want to say it was around 6 years or so. Then I went freelance, so I wasn't officially, an employee of this person or that person or the other. I was out there doing all kinds of stuff. That got me into working on lots of just different kinds of materials. I did a lot of auto racing work. I did a lot of auto auction work. So in 2009, we moved to Haiti. It was June 2nd, I believe, to start effectively what would have been a film school.
Oh, wow.
To teach Haitians. It wasn't about giving Haitians a voice. I believe every one of us already has a voice. It was really about helping a small group of Haitians to be able to use their voice to communicate to the outside world on their terms. If you hear stories about Haiti, you're probably not hearing them from a Haitian. You're probably not hearing from them from someone with dark skin. And so we went to Haiti to try and start a film school.
What's kind of noteworthy here is you said you moved in 2009, and if folks remember, the earthquake in 2010 devastated that area, and you were there for that.
We were, yeah. We were north of the epicenter, about 90 miles.
Wow.
Our house shook. We heard everyone in the surrounding community screaming because their houses were shaking, but nothing fell down. There was no carnage where we were. It was enough that there was no question something just happened. Right after that happened, everybody's phones stopped working. Haiti was largely operating on cell phones only. Landlines weren't really a thing. I don't know that there are many landlines. I'm sure there are, but most people are pretty remote down there. Even your internet is typically a satellite-based hookup. So if when you think about in the States, if the grid were to collapse, there is no grid in some parts of the world. You're your own self-sustained, free-floating entity. I was at first looking for information on what the heck has happened here, because we couldn't find out for ourselves because our phones in Haiti weren't working. We were getting sketchy, news. So I turned on CNN, right? Because we had satellite internet. We had a way to see what the outside world was saying. as the evening wore on, I started to realize, I don't know why I'm watching the news. I'm here, and I have connectivity. I am the news. And I had another friend in my ear who was basically telling me, like, you got to get to Port-au-Prince, and you got to get to work. And that was the impetus. I'm already a person who feels compelled to move his wife and kids to a developing nation. I wasn't. My thinking on the surface looked like this is a great guy with a big heart, but I was there because I had lots of psychological issues that I didn't know I had. I had childhood trauma. I never would have said I had trauma. Again, I was like anybody that I was running into when I made the film. I was self-selecting. Oh, no, that's not me. Right. I don't have trauma. But it was trauma that positioned me from a very early age to be a person who was living for the acceptance of others so completely that it actually had a lot to do with why we moved to Haiti. So I'm that guy sitting in Haiti, an earthquake hits. Of course I'm going to go run to the epicenter. Of course I'm going to go be a hero. I'm already being a hero, right? And I'm being self-critical here. I don't mean this seriously. I wasn't a hero. But I mean, that was kind of the idea in my head. So in a way, I didn't really have much of a choice. How is it that you're going to be on the ground there? You can get there. The airport was closed because the runway had split or cracked or something. And so I, next morning, ran to Port-au-Prince and spent 4 weeks basically getting a lot of bad crap going on in my head. And I developed PTSD from that.
Yeah, because you became, as you said, you became that news source. You were piping information back, weren't you?
I was, and it was all self-assigned. It was like, I'm just going to do this. I didn't really have a job. I didn't have people. Again, I was following that non-denominational script, although this wasn't about church. I was operating alone. I didn't have support. I didn't have counsel. I didn't have protection, nothing. I was just going to go down there and tell this story. And unfortunately, it put my eyes and my ears and my nose and my hands and put all of these, my senses into this, this place, this location on earth that was so full of mind-breaking stuff that, we talk in the film about mental models, and the idea that trauma forms when you have, I'll be real quick about it here. When you have an idea about this is the way the world works, and then something comes along and just shatters that, like completely overwrites the file and says, nope. Haiti for 4 weeks on the streets of Port-au-Prince after the earthquake was one mental model shattering after another. Everybody was passing information around. And one of the articles, I think we got this a couple weeks in, said, don't look at the hands and faces of the bodies. Don't look at hands and faces. Don't look at hands and faces. Well, I was 2 weeks into the first thing you do as just a biological human is you're looking for faces and hands. You don't even realize you're doing it, but whether it's a dead person or not. And so I had spent 2 weeks looking at faces and hands, and then I got this helpful note 2 weeks late. And, these are the things that show up in your nightmares in part. These are the things that haunt you. It's like those things that connect you to something that reminds you of you. Faces tend to do that. Hands tend to do that. We don't think about it, but if you think about you looking outside of your face right now, what's one of the number one things you see all the time? Your scenery changes. It might be the steering wheel of your car. It might be your neighborhood. It might be your office. It might be your computer in front of you. But your hands are always there. And there's this huge connection between who you are as an individual, as an existing conscious being, and the presence of your hands. And so seeing hands and seeing faces, it was like all of these lines were being crossed. But with all this extra information, like the death and the decay, it created a lot of chaos in my head.
Did you feel at first like there was some type of barrier protecting you from it, and then it started to creep in, or how did you start to really feel it?
Feeling was actually that one of the things I noticed while I was down there having these traumatic experiences. I was noticing that my own nature was changing a bit. And what I mean by that, for example, is I would recognize when I should be feeling feelings, but I wasn't. Like, I was very numbed out. I was around things that should have made me collapse. That was weird to me. Well, I was dissociating.
Yeah.
So when you find yourself in a traumatic situation, and when you find yourself having experiences that you go like, this doesn't feel like me. I feel like I'm behaving strangely here. That's the stuff you work with. That's the stuff you pay attention to.
When you start to describe that, and that disassociative place, because I think we experience it with loss. We experience it in a lot of different ways.
Yep.
But I think that as you start to crack that open, and that level of self-awareness that you're talking about, is that what brought you into a space of acceptance for this maybe trauma that I'm experiencing? Yeah.
So for like 3.5 years after that 4-week period where I would say I became traumatized, where I developed PTSD, it was about 3.5 years I had some key people in my life. My wife and my father were some of the main ones that had an audience with me. There were a lot of other people, but I wasn't going to hear from any of them. It's not at all uncommon to develop when you're in a traumatized state and you're stuck and you don't see a way out. It's not at all uncommon to hear that person take on the attitude of, I don't have a problem. Everyone else has a problem. In my case, I was very much that way, and that's why I say it took about 3.5 years for me to finally entertain the idea that maybe, in fact, I did have a real problem. Truth be told, I knew that I was not happy during that 3.5 years. But what I believed falsely was that I was too far gone. My problem is unreachable. It's unfixable. You, being everybody outside of me telling me what to do, you can't possibly fathom what's going on inside of me right now. For me, it took a couple of things, but generally speaking, it's when what was happening inside of me kept boiling over, like when you're making macaroni noodles and for whatever reason, it finds this perfect boiling point where it just decides to shoot foam all over your stove. You know what I'm talking about? So at some point, trauma, if it's really doing a number on you, it will boil over. There's a doctor in the film, Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I love what she brought to the project. And she talks about, healing and wellness and even trauma. There's a bit of an element to it where it's relative. You get to decide whether it's bad enough that you want to deal with it or just keep going on. Having said that, there is almost an objective point that most of the doctors, I think, would agree on, where trauma's not just like you get to decide whether you want to do something with this or not. And that point is when what's happening inside of you that's causing you internal problems, which can be physically manifest in your life, but they're still very sort of kept to yourself. When that boils over and starts causing trouble for other people, you're missing appointments, you're not showing up for work, you're forgetting to feed the goldfish, whatever the case may be. When your private battle sort of against your will or the will of anyone else spills over and becomes somebody else's issue and continues to be that is objectively when we can say this trauma is problematic. It's problematic. So for me, that's kind of what happened. I had one experience where I was at home. I was feeling incredibly crushed, like physically crushed. This is a problem that I have that stems to my childhood trauma, which incidentally is why what I saw in Port-au-Prince was so directly connected to what happened as a child, because as a child I had sexual mishandling, there was being crushed, there was having an airway blocked. Seeing those things connected so deeply to this forgotten childhood trauma of being trapped and held against my will and forced to be, and feeling like death is looming. That made such a profound connection. That's what triggered my PTSD. So I'm at home 3.5 or whatever, 3 years later. I had this moment where I started to feel trapped in my own body. I have that experience to this day quite regularly where and I can't even talk about it here too long because I'll start it up, where I literally feel like whoever I am, me, the Luke that is Luke, feels like he's inside of a body, and the body itself feels like a trap, feels like it's crushing. That can be crazy. And you can't get out of that. So I was at home one night, and I ripped all of my clothes, shredded everything off of me to the point where the only thing left on was my wedding ring. Wow. And bear in mind, my kids are around, my wife's around. Like, it wasn't like in a bubble bath. It was like a terrifying experience. And I went to pull this ring off because it felt too like I got to get out of this. I got to get this off. It wouldn't come off. My wife is threatening to call an ambulance because I look like I'm losing my mind. As soon as she says ambulance, I picture myself literally strapped to a gurney. Now I'm screaming at her. I can't explain what's going on, but I'm screaming, trust me, don't call an ambulance. Because I just knew. So she ran and got the butter, and we buttered my ring and got it off. The next week, I had my ring resized, bigger, so it would fall off easy. Like, it would be that easy to get off. But the truth is, and this was the second thing that broke me through, I entertained the possibility that I had a problem, which then let me pick up one of the books that my father had bought me some time earlier. But now I've got my toe in the water. Now I'm saying, okay, maybe. So I pick up this book. I start reading it. It's by Peter Levine, in an unspoken voice. And he's talking about gazelle or antelope, some kind of African, deer. And he's describing them, and he's describing their survival instincts. And I'm seeing myself in his words. He's not even talking about people. And so,
to protect, yes.
Going from feeling so completely out of the reach of help as a possibility to feeling not only back on the map, but feeling like this Peter Levine guy is reading my mail. Like, I feel dead center. I feel seen. That made me feel hope. Once that kicked in, healing became possible, because hope is a very different feeling than despair. It inspired me. He is in the film. He was the first doctor I reached out to. We were so fortunate. I reached out to some of the top minds. Literally the best-selling book in the field is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He hadn't even written that book yet. It hadn't been published when we started the film. So that came out while the film was being made. He's in the film. Peter Levine is in the film. Vincent Felitti, who, if people know about the ACEs study, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences study, he's in the film. There's a lot of big names, but it's also not a film that's just a bunch of doctors talking at you.
Yeah. What I found fascinating about it was that, and this is where I think that docu-narrative is so appropriate, is that it really is kind of bookended by your story. So there's this huge piece of experiencing this with you. And then there's a huge piece that I walk away with where I've learned through that process. And I think that was a very impactful piece. When you look at what you want someone to walk away with out of this, watching this docu-narrative, what would you say is the biggest takeaway you hope that someone can have?
This was a question I had to ask myself as the film was being made, right? I wanted to know the answer to that question before I started, and that answer, I would say, evolved as the project went on. Where it lands, where I'm at with it now, is I wanted probably I would hope that the film could do maybe a couple of things. One, I hope that it is able to do for some audience members what Peter's book did for me, which is to crack the door of hope. I do believe that there are an enormous amount of people out there who don't consider themselves to be victims of trauma. They don't think that their life right now is following old trauma rules. There's zero connection between struggling and pain that they may be having right now and trauma, right? There's people like that. I want to hopefully broaden the circle. So that's another dynamic. I want people to start taking their own suffering more seriously. One of the things I saw, because if you'll take it more seriously and you'll work on you, even if you improve your quality of life I don't mean the kind of house you live in. I don't mean the money you make. I mean the way air smells to you, whether you feel like living or not, whether you can ever feel happiness or joy, quality of life in those ways. If you can dial that up, even just a percentage or two, I think, first of all, that's worth knowing about. And practically speaking, I think it's worth experiencing. If people can just learn to take their own suffering more seriously and stop removing themselves from the conversation, I actually think that a lot more good, in almost a compounding way, like compounding interest, can come into the world. When I look at things like global warming, pollution, violence, gun violence, domestic violence, all kinds of criminality, when I look at all the different manifestations of human suffering, it's broken human beings who are trashing the planet. I'm included in that. All of this bad stuff that we do, all of this stuff that seems incredibly short-sighted, where we're not thinking about long-term impacts, we're thinking about short-term joy. I'm going like, if we can heal on the inside, I believe that a lot of these external problems are going to necessarily start to, I don't want to say they'll 100% self-correct, but we will awaken to them for sure, and then we'll be more in a place where we can start to correct them by changing our own behavior. Because trauma influences behavior. It either makes you do things that are not helpful, or it keeps you from doing things that could be helpful. I mean, that's the practical cost of trauma. And when you multiply that across every single person who's experiencing some version of that, I mean, the impact of trauma, for as invisible as it is mind-blowing. It's staggering. I mean, you've heard supporters of the traumatized get exasperated. You've heard people say things like, when are you going to be done with this? When are you going to get over this? When are you going to snap out of it? Can we move on already? Like, these are the kinds of things that you'll hear from people who maybe aren't struggling with trauma. The film has been helping both sides of that equation, and that's really what I wanted. And so far, it seems like we were successful at that, at least to some degree.
What Lies Inside is the docu-narrative film that we're talking about. Luke, I would love it if you would help people find how to connect with that film, to connect with you, if that's what you're looking for. But how can they find the film and get engaged with this conversation?
Yeah, so the film is available on a lot of streaming platforms. It's on Amazon, it's on iTunes, Apple TV. You can, if you have a cable provider, they may have it available as like video on demand. Basically, anywhere where you like to watch your movies, you go into the search and just search What Lies Inside. The full title is What Lies Inside: Healing in the Face of Trauma, but usually when you type What Lies Inside, it'll pop up at that point. You can find it in all those different kinds of places. So if you just remember the name of the film and search it, even if you Google it, you'll probably find it or its website, and you can figure out where you want to watch it. I do have a website where I do actually love to connect with people, LukeRenner.com. That's pretty easy, so you just type in my name and put a .com at the end. I'm basically, Shawn, I'm trying to do a lot more podcasting. I have a podcast. I'm getting ready to fire that back up. I'm so excited to be on your podcast. I just did one last week with some wonderful women who are doing a mental health podcast. I just want to be a part of, that community that owns it, feels comfortable talking about it, all not for the purpose of fetishizing it and living stuck in it, but for the purpose of healing, and experiencing the good that comes with that. One of the things that you hear a lot in the trauma world is that hurt people, which the idea that traumatized people can be traumatizers. I was definitely that way. With all of my junk over the years for my whole life, like, I was not an easy person to be around. I caused a lot of hurt and pain and struggles and probably trauma in other people, my own family included. What I learned in this project and what I hang out there for people, with all sincerity, is that the flip side is also true, which is to say that the healed become healers. And when you work on yourself, you're going to find that you're going to be able to turn that energy around at some point and help someone else work on some of their stuff. It doesn't mean we all become Superman or Superwoman. We're not superheroes, but we're better capable to really help each other with these deep issues rather than just like liking it, loving it, hating it on Facebook and moving on. We can actually learn how to re-engage one another for the ultimate benefit of healing one another so that we can have a better life. I mean, it sounds so simple, but that's really what that's what it's for.
Luke, I want to thank you so much for a couple of things. Number one, for taking your experience and the things that you have been through and being as transparent and authentic as you possibly can be. And number two, for spending time with our audience today, with me today, to share that. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. I really mean it. Thank you. It's an honor. I'm excited to be with you in the world of trying to make a difference and make an impact. So thank you for doing what you do and having a platform to begin with where all these different people that you speak to can speak, including myself. It's deeply fulfilling to, on the other side of healing and working on my junk, to have more things that I can do with that. So thank you.
The Switchpoint Project is part of the Switchpoint Media Network. Switchpoint Media creates raw and revealing conversations that explore the intersection of self and social awareness, growth, and authentic human connection. For more great podcasts and videocasts, be sure to join us at switchpoint.media.